Let's begin with a pair of boots, not just any boots. These are the 7-league boots. You've heard of them, maybe in an old story, maybe as a passing reference. A pair of enchanted shoes that let the wearer travel 7 leagues with every step, that's 21 miles, in a single stride. But this isn't just a fairy tale. The 7-league boots didn't appear out of nowhere. They weren't invented for a bedtime story. They're a whisper of something older, much older. Before the Brothers Grimm, before castles, before maps, before even the idea of walking as a human act. Because hidden beneath this story is a memory. One so old it no longer remembers itself. A memory of gods who moved without touching the ground. Of kings who ruled by walking faster than their enemies could think. Of witches, spirits, and dead men, all wearing the same impossible boots. Some say this is just magic, but others believe it's a trace of something real. A forgotten technology, a broken theology, a myth too old to know where it came from. Today we'll follow the footprints, not across a forest, but across 400 years of myth, metal, and memory. Because once you know what the 7-league boots truly meant, you'll never see walking the same way again. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Jack. You might remember him as the one who climbed the beanstalk, stole from a giant and returned home with treasure, but that's only part of his legend. In another version of the story, Jack doesn't just steal gold, he takes something else. A pair of boots, not ordinary boots of course, they're called 7-league boots. When Jack puts them on, he can cross 7 leagues in a single step, that's over 20 miles. He can outrun storms, outpace armies, leap over mountains. In most tellings, Jack becomes a hero not because he's strong or wise or noble, but because he's fast, faster than anyone else, fast enough to trick giants and kings, fast enough to change his fate. It sounds like a story made for children, simple, magical, safe, but think about what it's really saying. It's not just a story about movement, it's a story about power, about the boy who was nothing until he could go where no one else could follow. And it's not just Jack. 7-league boots show up across European fairy tales, sometimes worn by ogres, sometimes by witches, sometimes left behind like cursed relics. In French folklore, they're used by Puss in Boots to serve his master. In Romanian legends, they are hidden by spirits and guarded by riddles. In Slavic tales, they're worn by the devil himself. Or is the same rule? 1 step 7 leagues. But here's what we forget. These stories were told long before most people even knew how far a league really was. They didn't measure distance the way we do. They felt it. The boots weren't about numbers, they were about doing the impossible. And every child who heard those stories, sitting by the hearth, watching shadows move, understood what they meant. They weren't just dreaming of magic, they were dreaming of escape, of a way out of the village, out of hunger, out of war, because for thousands of years to move quickly, to move at all, was a luxury, a miracle, and so the boots became something more, a symbol, of freedom, of power, of going where others couldn't. That's what Jack really stole. Not gold, not glory, but motion. We laugh at the idea now. Fairy tale boots that could cross countries. But for a child born into stillness, into mud and walls and borders, speed was magic. And the one who moved the fastest was the one who got away. They look simple. Just a pair of boots, leather, buckled, maybe a bit worn at the edges, but nothing in folklore is ever just what it seems. In stories, boots are not tools, they are transformations. When Jack slips on the 7-league boots, he doesn't just move faster, he becomes untouchable. He escapes the laws of time and space, and maybe something deeper than that. Because in the ancient world, to walk was to live, and to travel faster than a man could run was to become something more than human. We forget how sacred walking used to be. Long before wheels, roads, and horses, humans moved on foot and only by pain. Every journey was written in the souls, every mile a burden. To go from one place to another meant sweat, hunger, exhaustion, danger. Your legs told your story. So when myths tell of boots that defy all of that, they aren't just telling stories of magic. They're telling dreams of escape from the human condition. And this is where it gets stranger. Because 7-league boots weren't the only enchanted footwear. Across cultures, shoes meant something. Always, always. In Norse sagas, warriors are buried with boots on, so they can walk to the afterlife. In ancient China, emperors wore special ceremonial shoes, never to be seen dirty. In Egypt, slaves went barefoot. Pharaohs wore sandals laced with gold, shoes revealed status. Shoes told the truth. You could wear a crown and still walk in mud. But if you had boots that carried you above the ground, that meant something else entirely. And in fairy tales, they are always worn by the outsider, the trickster, the wanderer, the one who doesn't belong. Think of Puss in Boots. He's not noble, not born to anything, but he wears the boots, and suddenly he has a path, he has speed, he has the power to shape a story that isn't his. The boots let him jump social lines, cuts across systems, because boots are rebellion, mobility where none is allowed. And think of witches. In many folktales, they aren't flying on broomsticks, they're leaping across hills in enchanted boots, fast, unseen, terrifying. The townspeople say they move too quickly to be real, as if motion itself is a threat, and maybe it is, because speed breaks rules, speed escapes control. The church feared women who moved without permission, the law feared messengers who couldn't be stopped, and folklore feared those who left without a trace. 7-league boots didn't make someone powerful, they revealed that they already were. And here's the twist. Most who wear them in old stories aren't heroes. They are thieves, liars, spirits, monsters. As if the boots came with a warning, move too fast and the world will think you're not one of us anymore. And maybe they're right. Maybe these boots weren't made for mortals. Maybe they were made to remember something else. A time when the ground wasn't so heavy, when the earth didn't pull so hard, when movement was a gift from the sky, not a punishment from the flesh. Because they were never just boots. They were an idea, a longing, a shadow of something we lost long ago, not speed, but the right to move freely. Long before fairy tales, before Jack or witches or boots with names, there were gods. And the gods didn't walk, they moved. In a blink, in a breath, across oceans, across skies, across the fabric of the world itself. And on their feet, there was always something sacred. In Greek mythology, Hermes, the messenger god, didn't wear boots. He wore sandals, but not ordinary ones. They were winged, crafted by Hephaestus himself. Fast as thought, light as wind. With those sandals, Hermes could slip between realms. Mount Olympus, Earth, the underworld. He moved through them like a thread through cloth. No border could hold him. No barrier slowed him. He was the god of travellers, of thieves, of sudden appearances and disappearances, and his feet never touched the dust unless he chose to. But the Greeks weren't alone. In ancient Egypt, Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, was said to glide across the stars. He carried messages between the worlds, like Hermes, and the gods of the Nile, when they appeared in human form, were always shown in sandals of gold. In India, Vishnu, the preserver, took giant steps across the universe. In one of his avatars, he crossed the 3 worlds in just 3 strides: the heavens, the earth, the underworld. 1 step each. Not walking, commanding. These aren't stories about shoes, they're about authority, control, divine movement. Because to move freely through realms, through space, through law, was the privilege of gods, and humans noticed. That's why in temple rituals across the ancient world, gods were carried, not walked. Statues were paraded on litters, priests lifted them high, feet were holy, and touching the ground? That was for mortals. So when a mortal in a story moves like a god, when he crosses leagues in a step or leaps across mountains, something old stirs beneath the tale. Not magic, not luck, but memory. A memory of beings who came from the sky. Beings who arrived fast, too sudden, too strange. Beings whose feet never grew dirty. And here's where things get eerie. In Sumerian texts, among the oldest writing we have, there are stories of gods who descend from the stars. Anunnaki, shining ones. They bring law, metal, war, harvest. They move between heaven and earth in flying chariots, described in glyphs that defy easy translation. They are not bound by time or gravity or roads. They walk as if walking was still a divine act. And then, one day, they stop coming, and the world becomes heavy again. But the stories remain. And in those stories, boots appear. Sandals, slippers, hooves, anything that touches the earth, but does not belong to it. Like a fossil of movement, a footprint of godhood, a message carried on leather soles. So when a child hears a tale about magical boots that cross 7 leagues, they are not just hearing a fantasy, they are hearing a trace, a thin golden echo of something that once descended from the stars and left only footprints behind. Before Greece, before Rome, even before Egypt rose from the Nile, there was Mesopotamia, the land between 2 rivers, the place where writing was born and where the sky was not just above you, but alive. In their oldest tablets, pressed into clay more than 4,000 years ago, the Sumerians told stories, not of fairies, but of beings who came from the heavens. They called them the Anunnaki. Not gods exactly, not angels either, but something in between. They were described as luminous, heavy with presence, carriers of knowledge, of law, of fire, of metal, and most of all of movement. The Anunnaki descended in what the texts called me, divine powers, impossible tools. Some scholars think of them as codes or blueprints. Others aren't sure at all. But the descriptions are strange. They didn't walk to the cities. They appeared, suddenly, effortlessly, and when they returned to the sky, there were no roads behind them, no footprints, only myths. In one Akkadian hymn, a god named Ninurta steps across mountains as easily as the falcon flies. In another, the goddess Inanna steals the me from the heavens, riding down in full armour, her feet untouched by the dust of men. They don't crawl through time like mortals. They skip, leap, fall like stars, rise like breath, and they always leave something behind, a weapon, a word, or a ritual, or a pair of boots. You see, in Mesopotamian burial sites, archaeologists have found things that don't quite belong. Tiny carved shoes placed beside skeletons, so worn they seem ornamental. Leather wrappings with traces of gold thread. Soles flattened by something other than walking. Some think they were ritual. Some think they were offerings. Some think they were meant to be used after death, because the journey didn't end in the grave. In the Mesopotamian vision, the underworld was far away, below the earth, across a vast dusty plain, and this dead needed help getting there. So they were buried with food, with water, and sometimes with shoes. But not just shoes for walking, shoes to go faster, shoes to outrun demons, to reach the gates before they closed, to find the river before it dried. Movement was survival, even in death. And here's the strange part, the idea that you could cross a vast distance, not by horse or boat or wind, but by wearing the right thing. It didn't stay in Sumer, it spread to Babylon, to Persia, to the Greeks, to the forests of Europe, changed, distorted, but always recognizable. A child hears about a boy who puts on boots and disappears in a blink. A traveller prays to the gods to grant him light feet. A dead man is wrapped in shoes of leather and gold so he might walk beyond the veil. And we call it myth, but maybe it isn't. Maybe these stories are shadows of something we once believed, or saw, or followed. Because the sky didn't always belong to planes and satellites. It used to belong to gods, and those who walked across it left legends in their wake. In ancient stories, kings didn't just rule because of blood or birth. They ruled because they could move where others couldn't, and move faster than anyone else. The earliest kings were not called the wise or the strong. They were called the walkers, the swift-footed, he who crosses the mountains, he who circles the earth in one day. Speed was sovereignty, because movement meant reach. Reach meant control, and control was godlike. In old Egyptian hymns, pharaohs are described not just as divine sons of Ra, but as those whose steps stretch farther than the eye. Some temples even have murals of pharaohs with unnaturally long strides, feet lifted as if defying gravity. Not running, gliding. It wasn't about muscles, it was about momentum. In ancient China, emperors conducted in section tours around their vast domains, not just as politics, but as ritual. To walk the land was to bind it, to cross the distance was to claim it. One old proverb said, "A ruler who does not move loses the loyalty of the soil beneath him." So they built fast carriages, sent fast runners, and imagined boots blessed by dragons. Even in medieval Europe, kings were rarely still. They moved constantly from castle to castle, field to field. A king who stayed in one place too long was seen as weak, rotting into stone like the throne he sat on. Speed wasn't convenience, it was a statement. And it wasn't just human rulers who moved fast. In the Old Testament, and Elijah is said to have outrun a chariot. Not by horse, not by magic words, just by moving with the power of God behind his feet. It's said he girded up his loins and ran before the king's chariot, and the dust never touched his ankles. Even the prophets moved quickly, because holy truth doesn't crawl, it arrives like thunder, or doesn't arrive at all. So what about those stories, where someone finds boots, puts them on, and becomes more than they were? What if that isn't fantasy? What if it's memory? A memory that speed used to mean salvation, that those who moved faster lived longer, saw more, escaped the flood, reached the mountain, warned the village before the fire came. Because for most of human history, being too slow didn't mean being late. It meant being dead. Speed was magic, not because it was impossible, but because it was unfairly given. The one with the boots wins, not because they fight better, but because they arrive first, and that changes everything. That's why the 7-league boots are so wondrous in stories. They shift the balance. They take a nobody and make them faster than the crown. They make the poor boy outrun the army. They make the hunted girl vanish over the hills. They make the trickster slip through walls. They give the powerless bow range. And in a world built on distance between ruler and ruled, castle and village, mountain and grave, range is revolution. So maybe those boots didn't just symbolize magic. Maybe they threatened something deeper. The idea that rule was earned, that power belonged to the still, to the heavy, to the throned. Because if someone could cross the kingdom in a single step, then walls meant nothing, borders meant nothing, bloodlines meant nothing, only speed mattered, and speed could be stolen. We think of boots as something for the living, to march, to run, to flee, to chase. But in older stories, boots don't always stop at the grave, they follow you in. Across cultures, across time, across stone tombs and ash urns, people were buried with shoes. Why? Because even in death, the journey wasn't over. In ancient Greece, the dead were often laid to rest with sandal, not just as ornament, but as preparation for the road ahead, for the long walk to the underworld. The soul, they believed, had miles to go before it reached the gates of Hades, over rivers, through shadows, past the fields where memory fades. You needed shoes, or you'd be trapped wandering, barefoot, lost and forgotten. In Viking graves, archaeologists have found carefully tied leather boots beside the dead, sometimes placed at the feet, sometimes packed at the side, ready, as if someone expected them to get up and walk again. Because for the Norse, death was not rest, it was movement, toward Valhalla, toward hell, toward judgment, and only those who moved well, who crossed the right thresholds, found peace. Even in ancient China, the dead were buried in soft silk shoes. In Mesoamerican tombs, miniature sandals were carved from jade. In parts of Eastern Europe, leather soles were nailed down with coins, so the dead could pay the ferryman and still have protection from thorns along the path. Death was not stillness, it was the last road, and boots were your passport. But it went deeper. Some legend said that ghosts who couldn't move on were the ones who'd lost their shoes. The woman who haunts the well, she's barefoot. The soldier who roams the battlefield, he left his boots behind when he fell, the spirit stuck between worlds. He runs, but never reaches the door. And so the living began to fear lost footwear, to bury their loved ones with care, to tie the laces, to stitch blessings into the leather, to whisper prayers into the soles, because if you gave the dead the right boots, they wouldn't come back, but if you didn't, they might. Even in medieval Europe, whispers spread of dead shoes, objects that held a soul's last step. They were kept under beds, burned in secret, hung in barns to ward off evil, and in some households, people believed that if you placed boots at the threshold, the spirits would pause before crossing. Not because they were afraid, but because they remembered. They remembered their feet, their path, the miles they had walked in life, and the boots waiting in the dark. So when we hear of 7-league boots, we think of magic, of speed, of heroes, but maybe they were meant for the dead. Maybe they were not tools for escape, but for passage. Maybe the boy who puts them on doesn't become a traveller, but a messenger, or a soul, or something in between. Maybe he's walking where no one else dares, not through kingdoms, but through veils. Because in the oldest stories, the boots didn't just make you faster, they made you seen. By gods, by ghosts, by the earth that remembers every footprint you ever left. And when you wear the wrong pair, you don't just go far, you go where you can't come back from. Speed was never innocent. Not in the old world. To move too quickly, to appear without warning, to vanish without leaving footprints. That wasn't seen as a gift. It was a threat. Because in many ancient cultures, if someone moved like wind, they were no longer entirely human. They were something else. A witch, a spirit, a walker of forbidden roads. In old German folklore, it was said, "The devil gives boots to those he favours, and they never make a sound." Stories spread of women who could cross fields in a blink, who were seen in 2 places at once, who left no tracks in snow, who arrived before they were summoned. People didn't call them fast. They called them cursed. In Slavic legend, the Baba Yaga lives deep in the forest. She doesn't walk, she floats. Her hut spins. Her feet never seem to touch the ground. She doesn't wear boots, but her victims do. Because once you enter her territory, you have to run, and ordinary legs won't save you. In the Scottish Highlands, whispers told of wind walkers, women who could ride the air with nothing more than a charm stitched into their shoes. If you angered one, your harvest would fail, your child would fall ill, and you'd hear footsteps on your roof, though the earth was silent. These weren't fairy tales. They were warnings, because for centuries speed was linked to suspicion. Men on horseback were warriors, but women who moved fast, they were witches. Even in the European witch trials, records mention boots of passage. Leather footwear supposedly enchanted to cross vast distances. Some claimed witches could walk from one town to the next in a single breath. Others swore they flew, but always with their boots still on. It terrified the church, because if someone could move without permission, without being seen, without being stopped, then power itself was at risk, and so leather became dangerous. Boots were burned, shoemakers were questioned, spells were stitched into seams or pulled out under torture. One old English charm reads, "Bless these souls that they may never fly nor carry feet beyond what God has given." Speed was now heresy, and movement was rebellion. But beneath the fear was something deeper, something older, a belief that feet were sacred, that to move between places unnaturally fast meant crossing realms, not just land, but boundaries between worlds. Witches, they said, could walk between realities, one step here, the next in shadow. And if that's true, then maybe the boots weren't evil. Maybe they were bridges, gifts, or relics, left behind by something long gone, because in some myths the witches don't steal the boots, they inherit them, from a grandmother, from a god, and from something that once fell from the stars and never returned. So we burned them, out of fear, out of ignorance, out of a desperate need to slow the world back down. But stories don't burn, and neither do boots. They still appear, in dreams, in tales, in the faint sound of footsteps just behind you, when the road is empty. Because what we feared was never the witch. It was the speed, the silence, the step that broke the rules of the world, and the boots that let her do it again. Distance is a constant. We measure it in steps, in miles, in hours on a map. But what if it's not? What if distance isn't real, just something we agreed on to make sense of separation? Because in the oldest philosophies, what mattered wasn't how far you went, but how fast you changed. In medieval alchemy, the body wasn't the thing being transformed, it was the world around it. To the alchemist, walking was never just walking. It was an act of will, of shifting energy from one state to another. Lead into gold, dark into light, here into there. And the 7 league boots? They weren't just tools of speed, they were instruments of transformation. Put them on, and the world collapses beneath you. Distance folds like paper. Hills become steps. Borders become shadows. The terrain stops mattering because you're no longer part of it. You've become something else. In some old Arabic texts, desert mystics speak of travel by intention. The idea that if your purpose is pure, you arrive before you begin. No camel, no road, just will. The boots, perhaps, were leather versions of that belief, wrapped around your feet but powered by something far more ancient: desire, focus, need. In Indian yogic traditions, the siddhis, spiritual powers, include lakhima, the ability to become light enough to float, and prapti, the power to reach anywhere instantly. Sound familiar? These weren't seen as miracles. They were natural outcomes of inner transformation. So when stories speak of boots that bend distance, maybe they're not just fairy tales. Maybe they're coded instructions, memories of how space once behaved differently, or how we once believed it could. Because in those stories, the boots don't just change where you are, they change who you are. The boy becomes a thief, the servant becomes a prince, the hunter becomes a god. Not by force, but by motion. The world treats him differently because of what he can reach. And that's the real magic. Imagine being able to step into the forbidden forest and be out before the wolves even see you. Imagine reaching the top of the mountain without the climb. Imagine never being late again, not to a meeting, but to your own life. That's the alchemy of distance. It doesn't change the path, it changes the walker. And maybe that's why the boots are so rare in the stories. Not because they're hard to find, but because they're hard to survive. Not everyone is meant to move that fast. Not everyone is ready to leave the world behind, to blur the hills, to erase the maps, to become a ghost among the still. The terrain, once transformed, does not welcome you back. And that's the cost. Not pain, not danger, but disconnection. The walker becomes unrooted, untethered, unseen. And that's why the stories end the way they do. The boots are lost, buried, stolen by giants, guarded by riddles, returned to the earth. Because the power to bend distance is also the power to disappear. And maybe we're not afraid of how fast they move. Maybe we're afraid of what they leave behind. Some stories walk, others run, but a few. They don't stay still at all. They leap from continent to continent, from one mouth to the next, from memory to myth, without ever looking back. And the tale of the 7 League Boots is one of them. It doesn't belong to one country. It doesn't wear one name. In France, it's les bottes de 7 lieues, worn by ogres, chased by cats, stolen by children. In Poland, they're said to be hidden in the roots of cursed trees. In Scotland, they're boots of fey origin, only fitting those with no home. In West Africa, griots speak of magical sandals that let warriors strike across villages in one night. In Persian lore, the simurgh gives feathers, not boots, but the power is the same: sudden movement, divine flight. Different shoes, same pattern. A humble figure gains impossible speed, uses it, escapes with it, changes because of it, and eventually, since it loses it. It's as if the story itself refuses to stop moving, as if it must keep shifting shape to survive. Because this isn't a fairy tale that grows old and quiet. It adapts, like wind, like lightning, like something that was never meant to be pinned down. Why? Maybe because what it represents is too big to stay still. The dream of freedom, the hunger for speed, the ache of being trapped in one place, and the fantasy of not being. For peasants who had never seen the next village, for women locked inside walls, for slaves, for soldiers, for children who knew only fences, the 7 League Boots were not luxury. They were salvation. And that's why the story survives, because we keep needing it. Even now, we chase versions of those boots, in trains, in planes, in algorithms, in data transfers that blink across oceans faster than thought. We build speed. We crave it. We sell it. But deep down, we still whisper about something older, something wilder. Not a machine, not a motor, but a pair of boots, soft, Caitlent, tied with the spells and secrets. We still tell the story, even if we don't remember why. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the story moves so much because it's trying to outrun something, or return to something, or maybe it just doesn't want to be caught, because the second we name it, own it, turn it into a brand or a bedtime rhyme, we lose what it was, not a product, but a prayer, not entertainment, but longing. So the tale slipped away again, changes shoes, crosses another border, and waits for the next soul who needs to walk far and fast. And when it finds them, when it slips back into the world, it always starts the same way. Once upon a time there was a pair of boots, and they didn't stay put. Somewhere in the woods of story there's always a pair of boots waiting. Worn, silent, tied shut with the wind itself. They never ask for payment, they never make a sound, they just wait until someone dares to wear them. Because not everyone does. Most of us spend our lives walking, step by step, road by road, held down by time, by gravity, by fear. But the ones who put them on, they don't ask for permission, they don't wait for the map to be drawn, they move, and the world moves around them. The 7 League Boots have no GPS, no compass, no destination. They are made for those who are ready to leave something behind, or maybe ready to become something new. I used to think they were just a fantasy, a symbol for freedom, a trick to skip hardship, a cheat code for fairy tales. But now, I'm not so sure. Because I've seen how distance changes people. How crossing even a small line between house and road, city and field, fear and courage, can open something ancient inside. I've felt what it means to outgrow your old self, to move faster than your past can follow. And maybe that's what these boots always were. Not magic, not footwear, but permission to outpace who we were. Think about it. Why do the boots always leave? Why does the story end when the child returns them, when the trickster hides them, when the ogre loses them in the forest? Because we're not supposed to wear them forever. They are not made for comfort. They are not made for safety. They are made for the moment you realize the ground beneath you is not where you're meant to be. And then, one leap, one long stride, a step bigger than you ever imagined, and you're gone. You don't walk into destiny, you fly into it. We call them 7-league boots, but really, they're just a reminder that we were never meant to move slowly, not in spirit, not in purpose, not in becoming. Somewhere deep in the oldest parts of the human mind, we still remember a time before stillness, when movement was divine, when stories had wings, and when people like us, who once crawled, dared to run. And maybe that's why we still tell this story. Not because we believe in magic boots, but because we believe in the ones who wear them, and who never come back the same. I don't know if I'd ever be brave enough to wear them, to take one step and lose everything I've known. But sometimes when the world feels small, though, when I feel like I'm stuck in a body that was made to stay still, I think about those boots, and I wonder, what if I didn't have to walk anymore? What if I could fly?